This is simply insane. And that is why I introduced the D.C. Crimes Act, which lowers the definition of youth from under the age of 25 to under the age of 18, removes the ability of judges to sentence youth offenders below mandatory minimum guidelines, and requires the D.C. Attorney General to establish a public website containing much-needed statistics on juvenile crime in D.C.
He was given a third chance, and now he's the face of a bill that would not afford young people in Washington, D.C. the same opportunities afforded to him. Let me be real. If he had grown up under Donald Trump's America or under the very D.C. crime bill he's pushing today, he wouldn't be standing here as a member of Congress. He'd still be...
When a politician who built his entire career on second chances turns around and tries to criminalize second chances for everyone else. That's not just hypocrisy, that's moral fraud. And today, on the House floor, that fraud got exposed in the most devastating way. If you ever needed proof that conservative law and order is just selective mercy wrapped in fearmongering, this is it. What's up, everyone? Welcome back to True Liberty, where we cut through the noise, dismantle the propaganda, and talk about what actually matters in a democracy trying to survive the outrage machine. I just watched one of the most jaw-dropping moments on the House floor, a speech that wasn't just a rebuttal, but a mirror, held up to a political movement that pretends to be tough on crime, while quietly building its success on the kind of grace it wants to take away from others.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of my bill, H.R. 4922, the D.C. Crimes Act. Now, in reference to what the gentleman was just talking about, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the United States Constitution is quite clear. It grants Congress the power to exercise exclusive jurisdiction over the federal district, which all Americans know now is Washington, D.C., and it is the nation's capital. That is in the Constitution that was ratified by the several states. Congress does have the constitutional authority to regulate activities within the federal district. So when it is said that somehow Congress is now eroding local control, that is simply not true. Any local powers by the D.C. City Council have been granted to the D.C. City Council by Congress, and Congress is the seat of authority when it comes to the federal enclave. It was also talked about Florida's laws. Well, let's be very clear. Florida has established itself as a beacon of law and order and making sure that our citizens are safe throughout all of our jurisdictions. So if there are some abilities for some measures of flexibility, Florida has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that it knows how to keep its people safe. Very different with respect to the D.C. City Council and with respect to crime, escalated crime here in the nation's capital. Our great nation's capital has been plagued by violence, destruction, disorder for far too long, and decades of weak, pro-crime leadership has turned this once great city into a dystopia. I would remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that some of their colleagues have been victimized by the crime here in Washington, D.C. Rather than prioritizing the safety of law-abiding and protecting the lives of innocent residents and visitors, district officials have actively facilitated dysfunction and chaos through their progressive soft-on-crime policies. Instead of addressing the clear epidemic of youth crime in the city, the D.C. City Council increased the age of youth offenders to individuals 24 years old and younger, meaning fully grown legal adults in the District of Columbia can receive sentences meant for children. This is simply insane.
And we need to talk about it, because this debate isn't just about D.C., it's about power, redemption, and who gets access to humanity in America, and who doesn't. If you're into honest analysis, bold commentary, and actually understanding the stakes beneath the headlines, stick around. And hey, if you want more breakdowns like this, feel free to stay connected. No pressure, just glad you're here. Because here's the real twist nobody on the right wants you to hear. The man pushing this bill, the one arguing young people shouldn't get leniency, only became a congressman because he got leniency. Twice. Maybe 3 times. This isn't just hypocrisy. This is weaponized forgetfulness, and it's time to drag it into the light. So let's start with the obvious.
This is simply insane. And that is why I introduced the D.C. Crimes Act, which lowers the definition of youth from under the age of 25 to under the age of 18, removes the ability of judges to sentence youth offenders below mandatory minimum guidelines, and requires the D.C. Attorney General to establish a public website containing much-needed statistics on juvenile crime in D.C.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I sat and listened to the beginning of this debate, my heart simply broke. And many people know me for being able to do alliterations, and all I could think about was amnesia allows adolescent accountability avoidance agility from across the aisle. So work with me for a second. Imagine being a young man born to Jamaican and Panamanian parents who messed up not once, but twice. Imagine standing in front of a judge with your whole future hanging in the balance, and instead of prison, you are given a promise of mercy. Your record gets wiped clean. You get a second chance at life. Now imagine taking that promise and turning it into promotion. You go to college, you get a job, and even become a member of Congress. That's what redemption looks like. That's what America is supposed to be about. And that is exactly the story of the next wannabe governor from Florida. As a young man, he went through pretrial diversion for misdemeanor marijuana possession. As an adult, yet younger than 24, he was charged with and ultimately placed on probation for felony bribery charges, which ultimately were two expunged. He was given a third chance, and now he's the face of a bill that would not afford young people in Washington, D.C. the same opportunities afforded to him. Let me be real. If he had grown up under Donald Trump's America or under the very D.C. crime bill he's pushing today, he wouldn't be standing here as a member of Congress. He'd still be...
Conservatives love to push personal responsibility until it's their personal responsibility. Then suddenly, mercy is patriotic, consequences are optional, and redemption is the American dream. But the minute it's a 19-year-old black kid in D.C. facing a bad decision with a lifetime of consequences, suddenly law and order kicks in and the hammer comes down. It's not justice, it's selective punishment, strategically aimed at the communities with the least political power. The D.C. Crimes Act isn't about reducing crime. It's about manufacturing criminals by stripping away judicial discretion, developmental psychology, community accountability, the science of brain development, and the basic principle that young people deserve a path back.
He'd still be living with the weight of those charges. So let's call this what it is, opportunities for me, but not for thee. He climbed the ladder of redemption, and now he's yanking it right up from the D.C. youth. See, most of us were taught to lift as you climb, but clearly, some have forgotten to lift as they climb, and now they are committed to telling the next generation to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. I will not sit quiet while a man who was saved by grace turns around and tries to snatch grace away from others. If we're going to be real about crime, about communities,
time
about...
has expired.
I'd like to yield for an additional minute, please.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
About second chances and even third chances, then it needs to start with us looking in the mirror and remembering that even the author of this bill has a story too before he tries to lecture DC on safety. And it would be complete hypocrisy to have, hypothetically, someone convicted of 34 felonies to lecture DC on what to do with youthful offenders who have been scientifically shown not to have fully developed brains under the age of 25, especially if said multi-count convicted felon was in his 70s when he was convicted. What would be his excuse? Because his brain would be fully developed, and with that, I will yield back.
This bill intentionally redefines a youth to under 18, ignoring every credible scientific body in the world that says full brain maturation doesn't happen until around 25. It's not a crime bill. It's a pipeline bill, feeding bodies into a system designed to exploit them. The conservative framing here is painfully predictable. Chaos. Lawlessness. Soft on crime. Protect the innocent. These aren't arguments, they're fear triggers. They're used to distract from the real structural drivers of crime. Lack of economic opportunity. Gutted youth programs. Unaffordable housing. Neglect of mental health. Underfunded schools. And generational inequality engineered through policy. Crime doesn't come out of thin air. But conservative rhetoric always treats it like it does. Because once you erase the structural causes, all that's left is blame, and blame is politically profitable. The most powerful part of the speech today wasn't the policy critique. It was the moral truth. You cannot climb the ladder of grace, then kick it away from others. You cannot receive mercy as a young man, not once, not twice, and then turn around and pass laws denying that mercy to the next generation. That is the opposite of leadership. That is the opposite of integrity. That is the opposite of America's promise. If redemption worked for you, you don't get to criminalize it for someone else. Let's zoom way out. For over a century, tough on crime has been one of the most effective political tools for suppressing labor movements, disciplining poor communities, justifying over-policing, expanding the carceral state, and distracting voters from corporate exploitation. Crime rhetoric is not about safety. It's about control. And it always comes at the expense of marginalized communities, working-class families, civil liberties, and democratic accountability. Meanwhile, the wealthy commit corporate crimes that destroy entire economies and walk away untouched. This isn't about safety. It's about who the system decides is worth saving. And here's the kicker. The speech closed with one of the most devastating truths I've heard in Congress all year. If conservatives want to talk about accountability, maybe start with the man convicted of 34 felonies, in his 70s, who they're lining up to make president again. Because if a teenager in DUC has a fully developed brain and deserves no mercy, what's the excuse for that man? The hypocrisy is loud. The silence around it is louder. But today, someone finally said the quiet part on the House floor. This moment matters. It exposes a political movement that doesn't oppose crime, it exploits it. A movement that doesn't believe in justice, just punishment. If you want to keep unpacking this with me, you're always welcome here at True Liberty. Stick around if you want more breakdowns that go deeper than the headlines. Take care of each other, and let's keep fighting for a country where redemption isn't a privilege. It's a right.